In this lecture, we're going to be talking about texture brushes. Now, a texture brush is what it sounds like. It's a brush that has a lot of texture. It's not something you usually use for sketching, and it's not something you usually use for painting. It's something that you usually come over after you're done with most of your painting to add a little bit more texture to it. You can use it as you're painting for large sections, like maybe you're painting a bunch of trees or maybe some snow and you want to use a texture brush, but typically when you're doing some fine rendering with lighting and stuff like that, you don't often use a texture brush, but you can. So we're going to go over that and show you what entails a texture brush and what kind of properties you're looking for in it, okay? So texture brushes aren't quite the same as a paintbrush with texture in it. A texture brush is something that has basically a flat texture across the whole thing. So this grunge brush, for example, I'm going to pick a nice dark red here. We can see that this has a pretty solid texture all the way through, right? And the lighter I push, the lighter it makes it, and the harder I push, the darker it makes it. But it's probably not something we would use for painting just because it's a little bit too hard to control. But it could be really good for throwing some texture down on something. Another example here, let's find, this is a great example of a texture brush, this clouds brush, okay? Let's say we wanted to make something have a really nice broken up texture, something that feels more organic. It might not even actually end up being clouds, right? We could have this be whatever we wanted, but it just lends a really nice texture. Now, a lot of times when we're using a texture brush, sometimes it could be too small, or perhaps it isn't necessarily too small, but it's just not the right shape or from the right perspective, right? So let's find another one here. Let's say, here's a good example. Let's say maybe we want to put this zombie skin texture onto something, right? But the problem here is that the thing we're painting it on isn't really flat, right? It doesn't look at us head on, and so this kind of looks odd, right? It doesn't quite wrap around the way we want it to. So what we can do is use our selection tool and help manipulate that brush so that it fits our space more of whatever it is we're painting on, right? So maybe you want the ground to feel like that. You don't just want to paint, like let's just draw out a quick sketch really quick. Make a new layer and get my sketching brush. Let's say this is the ground here, okay? And we have some trees or whatnot, okay, and a house over here, right? And we want the ground to feel like this. And we're going to go ahead and clear that. We'll start over. We want the ground to have some sort of a texture on it, right? Well, if we were to just take our texture brush and draw it on here like this, it wouldn't quite feel right. It would feel really two-dimensional, okay? But if we go like this, we fill in a pretty good section here with our texture brush. Then what we can do is we can shrink this down and morph it to fit the perspective of what it is we're working on, okay? And that's going to make it feel a whole lot more like it's actually sitting on there. So you want to make sure that when you're using texture brushes, you're thinking about the angle and the perspective on which it sits. You don't just want to throw it on there and slap it on there from a flat angle. It's going to look weird, okay? It's a pretty wide range of brushes, right? And it can really be, just about anything. But you do want to keep in mind that you're not using this to be painting your main picture, right? So I wouldn't go in with my texture brush here. If we go back to, let's say, let's try like this rough skin one. This is not what I'm going to be using to paint stuff, right? I'm not painting with this. This is something I go in later after I've already painted my object and add a little bit of extra oomph to it to give it some more interest behind it, right? And you can use different layer modes and stuff like that to really help it mesh with the rest of your painting. But you want to make sure you're keeping that in mind, okay? And like I said, there's a huge variety, okay? And some brushes might end up going between, like this charcoal block brush that we use as a paintbrush. In some instances, you might want to use it more as a texture brush, right? Maybe you want to put in some patterning on the back of a creature you designed, or a little bit more texture into the skin of something after you've already painted it. You can totally do that, right? It just depends on the style you're painting in. So that's it for this lecture, and I'll see you guys in the next one.